checking.
Yeah, it says it's live on the Zoom stream here.
Okay, yeah, it says on there. Okay, so now I can see us on YouTube as well. Perfect. Yep, excellent. Yeah. Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for gathering here to discuss the topic. Certainly have a very exciting group of people to kick this off with. We're going to talk about the burnout survey that I conducted in the healthcare industry. It was a part of the dissertation that I wrote, trying to find the business solution to the burnout in our industry. And I'm happy to introduce you to John Tassan. So he's the medical doctor and the former health care CEO of Wisconsin Healthcare Association. He's the founder of Catalysis Education Institute, and he's one of the thought leaders in agile transformation in healthcare, and was basically an inspiration for me to actually write this dissertation. So, John, I'm appreciative for you joining here and actually giving me that direction. Then we have Marie Holovichuk. I can pronounce her last name because she's from, her background is from Ukraine, where I'm from. And she's a passionate advocate for veterinary well-being. She provides lectures and workshops in veterinary professionals, including online well-being programs that qualify for continuing education credit. She is also a boarded critical care specialist. So we also have Steven Sital. He's a registered veterinary technician, currently at Stanford University. Stephen is executive director for Academy of Laboratory Animal Veterinary Technicians and Nurses. He's COO of Veterinary Anesthesia Nerds, and he's an award-winning international lecturer. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining. And we have Dr. Griffin. So he's a veterinarian, co-founder of Veterinary Integration Solutions. He's a former chief operating officer of Pathway Alliance. He has over 20 experience of growing private and consolidated practices. So thank you everybody for joining. There's an exciting conversation. We're going to talk about the findings that I found through this survey. Myself, I guess I need to introduce myself. So I'm Ivan, a veterinarian with about 12 years of emergency experience. I switched to technology, built SmartFlow, if any of you guys know that product, and worked in software then at IDEX, and now a co-founder with Bill of the Veterinary Integration Solutions. And we're trying to solve these sort of business problems. So the purpose of the survey was there were several angles. So we all know about the burnout in the industry, and I experienced it myself through my years in veterinary as an emergency veterinarian. And so it's close to heart. And what I was trying to establish, we'll talk about the burnout. I wanted to first quantify it and understand whether we are burned out or not. And then slice the data and see if there are more conclusions that we can make out of it. I use Professional Fulfillment Index, and it's a tool developed at Stanford University, and it was previously applied in human healthcare and successfully compared to MBI, which is a standard for burnout. And the three interesting findings that we had, I'm going to start sharing my slides here. So one of them was that the veterinarians are burned out. So that's sort of was the foundational piece, and we wanted to make sure and establish sort of this as the concept. So yes, we are burned out. So from 0 to 4, it's from not at all to extremely, and there's questions that are directing and helping to make that conclusion. So the mean score showed that the veterinarians are burned out. The second finding that we didn't expect, but as we sliced the data, was that younger veterinarians are burned out, and the people that are sort of under 30 and in the mid 30s are more burned out than those that are later in their career. So that was an interesting finding that I would like to discuss today. And the third finding that didn't surprise me, but I was happy to put the light on that again, that veterinarians are not the only professionals that are at risk of burnout, and especially in the times like right now, There's so much pressure on the technicians, and the study did show that they were burned out. Additional point of this was, we wanted to identify, because the study was done in June, so it was right in the middle of, or in the beginning of COVID. So we actually did a survey on the channel with Stephen's help, and just to sort of reiterate, are you more burned out as a technician during the COVID? And there was a sort of alarming yes through the entire conversation there. So I would like to open up with asking Marie a question. First of all, you visited us on podcast, on Veterinary Innovation Podcast, and I loved how you articulated what is the burnout and what is compassion fatigue. So if you could maybe highlight that for us, and as well as maybe you could give us your opinion on the age of the veterinarians or veterinary professionals. So please.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Ivan. Thanks for having me in this incredible group of individuals, and thanks for all the important work that you're doing. As you said, we both share a passion for this topic, and I think it's interesting in hearing other people talk about burnout. A lot of the times people use those phrases burnout and compassion fatigue interchangeably, but as we've discussed, they're indeed very different things. The signs and symptoms can overlap for sure, and so it can be hard to deduce what a person might be experiencing, but it is important to recognize the difference, because very often the treatment is different. And so when we think about compassion fatigue, usually compassion fatigue is a sense of exhaustion when we think about the work that we do as helpers. So while any professional can feel burnt out, you could be an engineer, you could be a teacher, you could be a parent that's homeschooling right now, and you could feel burnt out. But if you're not in a caregiving profession, then you would not feel compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue really stems from that exhaustion from helping others so frequently and not, then giving back to ourselves. And what the veterinary social workers believe is that compassion fatigue in veterinary practice really stems from repeated incidents of moral distress. So those situations where we're put in a place where we really want to help, but we can't. So this may be in this time of COVID, this could be situations where we are just, simply too short staffed because half of our staff are out because of a COVID exposure. And so we're having to turn patients away. That would create an incident of moral distress where, we're doing something we shouldn't be doing. We're sending somebody away versus wanting to see them. And those repeated over time can lead to compassion fatigue. And people who experience compassion fatigue, they won't only feel unhappy when they're at work, they will feel unhappy and distressed when they are outside of work as well. So it really tends to follow them home, and in severe circumstances can be debilitating both in and outside of the workplace. Burnout, as I said, can affect any professional, and is that same sense of exhaustion or depletion, both physically and emotionally, but it stems from the job itself. So that could be, being pulled in too many different directions, being asked to do things that a person isn't familiar with doing, or asking a person to do something that they feel like overqualified to do, that's really boring and monotonous. But the key thing about burnout is that when a person is not at work, they're not feeling those signs. They feel, happy on the weekends, happy when they're on vacation. But then when it comes to going into work, they are dissatisfied. And a person who's burnt out, if you modify the workplace situation, which we'll talk about later, then that burnout can be resolved. Versus compassion fatigue, not so much. You could remove yourself from that situation, but still go into another caregiving situation. And if you're not still looking after yourself, then you will still experience those signs of compassion fatigue. So you can't, I see a lot of people in the profession going from job to job to job, thinking that things are going to be better. But because it's compassion fatigue they're feeling, and they're not addressing the root of that, or identifying identifying the cause, then they continue to experience those signs. So Ivan, I hope that answers your question about the burnout versus compassion fatigue.
That's amazing. Thank you.
To answer your question about this age-related finding, it's really interesting because, when we look at some of the other burnout studies in other demographics, looking at age or years in the profession and satisfaction with work, usually satisfaction with work is its lowest mid-career. So people experience like a mid-career crisis, just like some of us experience a midlife crisis. It can be seen as the same, but it does seem in your study that this happiness at work was really low in the younger professionals. And I'll be interested to hear what Stephen has to say about this, but I almost wonder whether people are going into the profession with these rose-colored glasses on, that they think it's going to be rainbows and butterflies and puppies and kittens, and we get in and it's hard. There's a lot of things that we experience on a daily basis that we just didn't anticipate having to deal with, whether it's the clients or the caseload or the medical records, or the monotony of some of the cases we might be seeing, or the distress of seeing cases that are far beyond our skill level, but the clients, can't refer to another professional because of financial reasons. So, I'm not sure if that is what it has to do with. There's so many different factors in play, but that would be my first inclination. And maybe these are individuals as well who haven't kind of been around, so to speak, long enough that they haven't cultivated these skills that have allowed them to sustain themselves. I think when you think about it, it's almost like a little bit of a biased population when you survey these individuals who have been working or in the profession for a long time. The people who didn't make it, they've all been weeded out already. So here you're surveying people who have clearly done something right to allow them to practice veterinary medicine for 20, 30 years. And so they have cultivated skills that have allowed them to do that, or, something else. So those are my thoughts. Thanks, Ivan.
That's awesome. Thank you for that feedback. I think that there's a lot of thoughts that come to mind, and I think that maybe that finding is actually opening more opportunity for research. Usually research does lead to another research rather than giving all the answers. So maybe this is one of those things. One thing that I forgot to mention that is but definitely is important, is that I didn't have a similar study done in non-COVID time. So we deployed it in June. I think there's tremendous interference with the clarity of, are they burned out, or is it, COVID effects? So there's that as well, but definitely, I appreciate your answer. So I wanted to shift gears then to the second finding and ask Stephen if you could comment on the finding that the technicians are actually more burned down than veterinarians. Is that something that we see in practice? I certainly did when I practice, and then whether we are highlighting it enough, or should we highlight it a little more and pay attention to this finding?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me again, and I'm happy to be the technician representative. I am by no means the expert on any of this stuff. I'm so glad Marie's here, because she really, at least in my mind, is the expert on the social aspect of all this. I was really put a lot of time and work, but from personal experience, I can say absolutely, a lot of these veterinary studies that are coming out have really been focused on the veterinarian, right? We know that veterinarians have high suicide rates. We know that veterinarians have high levels of compassion fatigue and burnout. But we are just now, and thankfully with your survey and another survey done by Dr. Kogan at CSU has really been elucidating some of the burnout in technicians and really describing that. And it's absolutely valid. And I think there's extra layers on top for technicians compared to what even veterinarians have, right? So veterinarians have this financial burden from school, especially this young demographic that we were just talking about. That's super stressful. But technicians have this added layer of having a stressed out veterinarian on top of what we're doing, right? And it's not to complain about the veterinarians. It's just we feed off their stress. You know, we always talk about these owners with their stressed out little chihuahua, and we're like, well, your dog's stressed out because you're all stressed out, and we get stressed out because you're stressed out. And it's just this horrible circle, this negative feedback loop, right? That keeps happening and happening over again. And you know, there's been a couple of surveys out there looking at why or what we can do to help alleviate some of this burnout for technicians. And one of the, it's interesting because my mind, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm male, goes towards, oh, it's probably because of the money factor, which is definitely a huge factor. But the number one thing in all of these surveys for technicians and why they feel so burnt out, why they are leaving this field so early, is because they feel underappreciated and underrespected, which is really interesting when you look at like some of these practice models and the ability to make money for these practices. When you use a technician to their fullest abilities under the law and to their licensure, the practice makes more money, the technician is happier, and we have less of this drama, this kind of toxicity that can build up within these practices, which I think is really interesting. You know, and then there's kind of the whole financial component. I do think there is a self-sabotaging approach that especially younger veterinary technicians coming to this field have, this ideology of, we don't do it for the money. Well, when I turned 30 and am living in San Jose, California, and paying $2,000 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment, it becomes about the money eventually. And, you know, I don't have a spouse to have dual income with. And so money is an extra pressure on top of everything. And, you know, we hear all these studies about, oh, take care of yourself, do these yoga retreats, go get a massage. I can't afford a cheeseburger on a weekend because I'm not getting paid enough. So that stress from not only being in the clinic, and maybe I'm enjoying the medicine part, but, you know, maybe the burnout that comes from difficult clients, maybe difficult interpersonal complexities within the clinic isn't carried on to my outside life because I don't have money to have fun and to live. So I think that's another big problem we as a veterinary industry need to solve for veterinary technicians. And there's been a lot of discussion, and there's been the development of unionization within the veterinary industry. And that's a whole other topic. Again, not my area. I'm still have mixed feelings on unionization, but you know, if a practice were to really listen to some of these studies coming out, really listen to their employees, the DVM staff and the technician staff, and really implement these guidelines that are being recommended, like what's happening in this presentation today, maybe we would have less movement towards these unionizations, which a lot of, especially corporate companies, don't really love the conversation that's going on, right? They're not super enthusiastic about unionization. But at the same time, you know, we have President-elect Joe Biden commenting on Twitter last year, you know, saying that these corporate entities need to step off and allow their people to unionize. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House here in the United States, wrote a letter to one of these larger corporate hospitals telling them to support their staff appropriately. And, you know, just commentary, this is not verbatim, paraphrasing, you know, there were in these talks with these technician groups that were trying to unionize to protect themselves, showed total disregard for those technicians. I believe it was something along the lines of veterinary technicians is just a stepping stone profession or a career, invalidating what we're doing. And it's like, well, if you think I'm just a stepping stone, yeah, I'm probably not going to stay here for a long period of time, or I'm not going to show my loyalty to you. So there, I mean, there's so many layers, but I think technicians especially have that extra layer of having a little bit of extra weight because the big guys, you know, are putting a lot of pressure on us to get things done, or we're feeding off their stress, which just compounds everything. You know, something that really struck me that Marie said is really the difference between compassion fatigue and burnout. And I was like, oh, I didn't really understand that very well, the difference very well. And I think I've gone through both. And what's funny about me in particular is I've always considered myself a pretty strong person. And I never thought I was really burnt out until I lost my job in end of April of this year, largely due to COVID. And I started realizing, holy cow, I was really burnt out. And I had a manifestation of compassion fatigue. And it's interesting too, because I always considered myself a really strong person. I never used to cry in euthanasias with people. I was always that strong person, trying to put on that strong face. And now I cry at everything. And I think that's maybe a manifestation, correct me if I'm wrong, Marie, of part of this burnout. Like I can't hold it together anymore. And it's so odd to me to have all these emotions. But it really was a wake-up call for me that I need to do better. And thankfully, I've edited a lot of things from my life that were causing all this unnecessary stress and fatigue in my life. I have a whole list of things I don't want to take up the time. But there's a lot of complexity. So again, like I said, underappreciation, lack of respect are top for veterinary technicians, followed by the money struggles that we have, right? Obviously, we have some pretty crappy hours at times. And again, this is a little bit of the self-sabotaging we do as technicians, which is compounded by pressure from management, maybe at times, is not taking our breaks and not taking lunches, trying to be that hero and working through things. Like, we need to stop doing that. We absolutely need to stop doing that and take our breaks and take our lunches that is given to us by law in many cases, right? We have to do that for our own mental breaks, to step out of the clinch, to go take a walk. Figuring out what life balance activities we can do outside of work that are maybe cost effective for us. And the interesting study from Kogan et al. For technicians and occupational burnout, they really talked about non-monetary ways veterinary clinics can help their technicians with this burnout in general. We already decided that, or there's already evidence showing that money isn't the biggest factor, but if veterinary hospitals can pay for that yoga studio registration, or could pay for a massage for their staff once a month, those aren't necessarily things we are getting money for, but those are things that the hospital is allowing us to cope with that burnout and get kind of that break from the hospital and that stress.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a lot to unpack there, and I certainly can sign under every statement that you made there. And it's when you were talking about the long hours and remember, emergency shifts. How many times you remember eating the tongue depressor in the back of the hospital between the patients without taking a real break? I mean, it's a real thing, and I think that highlighting that is super important, and creating that environment at work. And certainly when you mentioned about the euthanasia and not feeling it anymore and being a strong person, I thought that was my strength. And then after I heard these two different definitions from Marie, I realized that was probably a creeping up of cynicism and really not being sensitive to that anymore. And I think my record was 12 on the Christmas day. It's the worst day of the year, as we all know, right? Because that's when people come in with no money, and you're the bad guy asking for the payment for their pet. So I'm with you on that. I appreciate your comments, and I would like to shift now to Bill. So Bill has tremendous experience in both private practice, owning the hospital, as well as then growing the fastest growing in the world, Consolidation. So my secret agenda behind this study was to see if the consolidators are actually impacting the profession more. And then, because subjectively, it felt like there's more stress added by the consolidation, but in fact, so we surveyed whether the respondents were from private or from consolidated practices, and it actually showed no statistically significant difference between the two, which was very interesting. But as a sort of representation of this fast-growing organization that you've seen firsthand, Bill, have you seen the added stress, just subjectively, not in numbers, added while the practice is going through acquisition? And is there sort of the changes that you can see that could be done at the level of consolidation as large organizations?
Yeah, sure enough, Ivan. Let me just first say thank you to Stephen and Marie. what you guys are talking about and experiencing on a daily basis, obviously is very real. And, consolidation or consolidators have the opportunity. And honestly, I would say that the mandate to fix this. And, Stephen, you talked about unionization and, whether it's good or bad for the profession or, veterinary nurses and technicians, is unknown. But the compensation, the benefits, the education, the respect, for critical elements of the healthcare team is lacking. And actually, for me, Marie, you talked about coping. Personally, as an ER vet and a business owner, the way I coped was to leverage the healthcare team and to engage them at every level and empower them at every level. And so it truly was a team effort. It was not the doctor with the cape as a hero. And it's hard work. And I think that's why it isn't more commonplace. It is hard work to find the people that want that environment, that have the knowledge, that can have the capacity for it. So on the consolidation side, so to answer your question, Ivan, I'm not surprised that there isn't a statistical difference, because I think that, maybe with a bit more data and maybe without COVID, you might have been able to see that there was a difference within the consolidator. Most of the stress that occurs, post-acquisition, integration and operations is directed towards the seller. But more acutely, the practice manager or administrator or any of the leadership team, right, that is involved in the business aspect of providing care. Those people, right, for probably the first, I would say, 6 to 9 months post-acquisition, generally have their day job, which they're already pretty busy. And now they have the job of working directly with the consolidator and all of their business teams. And this is a significant stressor that occurs. And I've seen great successes where there is excellent alignment between the consolidator and the practice and the leadership team, and the experience is wonderful. Revenue goes up, satisfaction goes up, retention, right? All of a sudden the practice had trouble hiring people. All of a sudden the consolidator fills this recruiting role and they're getting great talent coming in. And everyone's thrilled. Then I've seen the opposite, where poor alignment, lack of cultural understanding, and basically it becomes an unmitigated disaster, where you have sellers leaving, you have key doctors and nurses leaving, you have clients that are calling the consolidator's home office. How they find the number is, beyond me, but they find it. And they are calling and sending emails to the consolidators saying that you basically destroyed the practice that, my parents, myself, and my children have been bringing their pets to for more than 30 years. So there is a huge disparity. I would say overall, though, it is a work in progress. And I think, consolidation, when I first started in 2016 with Pathway was visionary in the fact that, Stephen, part of the energy for Pathway was to elevate the veterinary technicians and the support staff. Part of it was on the emotional intelligence that is generally lacking in the veterinary space, and for Pathway to create awareness and training and learning about conflict was a huge opportunity, to work with a new group of people, bring them through, conflict training and emotional intelligence training to give them the tools to cope with the day-to-day operational stresses of practice. What we didn't really realize is that, simply by leadership change, ownership change, in some cases, small changes that you wouldn't think would be distressing, the act of consolidation in itself created significant stress. And the risk, the biggest risk to consolidation is loss of employees. We all know how hard it is to hire. We all know the cost of losing people, right? And if you think about that from a revenue point of view, not only if you lose a doctor, you're losing revenue. If you lose a good veterinary nurse or technician, you're losing revenue, right? You're losing capacity. You're losing knowledge. And it's not easily replaced because we don't do a great job with having training sessions and systems. And, I'd love John to compare and contrast a little bit on the human side, where, nurses obviously are trained to certain standards. Veterinary technicians are to some extent, but I think it's less structured. So, one of the things that consolidators have to do now is that there are stay bonuses. So literally to get doctors and key people to stay, in addition to buying the practice, they are now forced to pay a stay bonus to say, hey, if you will stay with me for the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, I will pay you a lot of money. So it's not an emotional connection, right? It's a financial transaction, which is not great. So it increases the cost of acquisition, and it also monetizes the relationship. The other thing too is, when it comes to benefits, whether it's pet benefits or human healthcare benefits, one of the most valued items. We did some analysis on this. It was a thing that people valued more than their compensation was their pet benefits. And it basically would keep people in a bad situation because of their great pet benefits, right? So if culturally was bad, emotionally, financially was bad, they would stay because they had great pet benefits. And if they didn't have it, they'd leave. So, having this deep understanding of what binds people to their practice is really important. The other thing too is, and I touched on it, is the leadership piece. What happens is, the practice owners or owner, they may or may not be great leaders, but they're there. We typically are there, right, on a daily basis, or maybe not every day, but mostly every day. There still is that we're working, shoulder to shoulder in the exam room, in the OR, right, in treatment, during triage. When you sell a practice, that day-to-day leader, if they're not truly bought in, they're truly not still on the floor, there's a gap in leadership. And until that is filled, the why do I come to work every day? Why do I deal with the euthanasia and the stress and the angry clients? And now on top of it, COVID. It's not there. And it's hard to replace. And I think consolidators are getting a little bit better and smarter about, what practices they partner with, the structures that they put in place, and how important it is to retain that leadership and that control. And then the other thing about the risk here is loss of control. Veterinarians are very independent, and they've been doing this for 20, 30 years. They built a successful business. They're selling it for a lot of money. But the day that they sign that contract, they typically are losing control of their business. And that's scary. I experienced it. I mean, I was a co-founder of Pathway. But I sold my business to Pathway, and then I operated my business, and then I operated as the COO of Pathway. So I got to experience the whole spectrum. And I remember the night I still practiced for a year while I was running operations of Pathway. I remember the night before that I was closing on the deal, I walked out the door, and I knew when I walked back in that I was not going to be the owner. And it was just an amazing experience. I mean, even today, I still feel it like, I am selling something that was so important that when I came back in, I would no longer have that control. And I've experienced people that have had emotional breakdowns because of this. Because they've lost their identity as who they are. They are the doctor, or people come to see them or come to them with problems. And now they basically no longer have that role. and they've lost their identity. And that creates a lot of turmoil at the practice level. So, is consolidation potentially a solution to the fatigue, the burnouts, the lack of quality pay? Can consolidation give veterinarians and veterinary nurses a better quality of life? I believe yes. I believe unmitigated, because it has to. There's no way to buy all these practices and then to not have a happy, engaged, productive workforce. So just from a pure dollar and cents point of view, that is the direction that it has to go in. I see the progress. I see the new consolidators. I see the effort that goes forth to creating a great environment. I also believe that the seller has a responsibility as well. Sellers are making a lot of money, and they have an obligation to their team. They have an obligation to the consolidator, and they have an obligation to the profession. And too often the sellers, they're tired. They get a lot of money and they want to take time off, and they become very disengaged. And so the more that the seller can, be engaged in the process, typically the better the outcome for the team. And then a last piece on this is technology, systems, and process. This is where the biggest challenge is. I think once consolidators improve this segment of their business, the experience of practices post-consolidation will improve. The challenge is they have the same crappy systems that practices have, right? The clinical systems are poor. The business systems are marginal, right? The processes are fragmented. And it's very difficult to provide meaningful support to hundreds of practices when you don't have standardized systems or processes or metrics. Even just communication. How do you communicate, across thousands of people? And so these are fundamental business infrastructure pieces that are improving, and the models are improving. And once they do, I believe that lean thinking and lean methodology that John's going to talk about, where you're empowering the frontline staff with data, with knowledge, right, and responsibility, is really where consolidation of veterinary practice needs to go and is going.
Thanks, Bill. That's awesome, and you actually gave two angles of the person who sold the practice as well as the consolidations. That was amazing. So that leads us to John. So I met you a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, and I sort of tried to explain what's going on in the industry, and I ended up pursuing that, and you were a great inspiration for me for that. So I appreciate that. But this is sort of where we're at. This is the baseline. This is what the industry is dealing with, and on top of that, with the whole COVID, and I'm sure that healthcare is also, suffering in many ways from that. But what Marie mentioned about the difference between the burnout and the compassion fatigue. So the burnout can change with the change of the environment. And that's where my hope is, that if the environment changes at work, then we can do something to improve that. And also what Bill very well articulated, that if there's no why behind it, I think that's what I heard clearly through what you're doing in healthcare, that there is a why. So if you can share sort of what you've experienced and what you've done in the healthcare industry and how that may relate to ours.
Well, thanks for having me, Ivan. It's been really fascinating to listen to all of you so far. I've taken a few notes that I want to sort of highlight. Pulled in too many directions. That's one thing Marie said. As we think about the burnout question, right? Pulled in too many directions. I'm overqualified to be doing some of the work that I'm doing. My medical records are problematic for me. Stephen said that I'm underappreciated and underutilized. not actually paid for what I could possibly do. To me, those are all the whys or some of the whys as to the fact that burnout exists, right? So the question is, how do you take those problems, the whys, and what do you do with it, right? How are we gonna improve this situation? I really look at your industry being about where our industry was probably 15, 18 years ago. I've been at this for about 20 years now, and have been applying the principles of what we call organizational excellence in healthcare for a long time. And what we've seen is, I mean, these points that you all raised are exactly the things that exactly the problems that we've had in human healthcare. So there's no, I think back to Marie's point of, anybody can in profession can get burned out. Well, whether you're a veterinarian or a, physician or an engineer or whatever, you potentially run into these issues. So frankly, when I became CEO of an integrated health system, these are the same questions as Bill was identifying. These are the same questions that I had. If I'm going to run a place that has 7,000 or 8,000 employees, how do I make it better for all of those people, realizing that they all have these same problems? And I guess what I've learned is that there is a way out of this, but it really starts. Again, back to Bill's point with the leadership, whether it's the healthcare leadership or the administrative leadership, we really have to do things differently. We have to think differently as leaders. And the thing that I've found now that really is the most important is to base the work that you do on a series of principles. And I think the principles we're talking about today, particularly as it relates to burnout or compassion fatigue, really come back to respect. It comes back to respect for people. So as we think about lean or organizational excellence, this is one of the fundamental principles of this method of management, which is respect for people. And it means it actually, as you were saying, some of these things take a lot to unpack. Respect for people in the way that we think about it from a lean standpoint is I respect you, frontline worker, to identify and solve the problems in the practice. I don't have to be in charge as the lead clinician to make all the decisions. Actually, what we want to do is make sure you understand how to solve problems. We need to train you to understand how to do that. And that's our role as leaders, is to really give up control, so to speak, to the people that do the work. And as we give up that control, that shows the ultimate respect. Back to Stephen's point, we're not appreciated. Well, guess what? Those technicians can solve a lot of the problems that the veterinarians have if we just let them, because they actually have the ideas that would allow us to be more successful. So I think the idea of the ultimate respect for people as a principle, right? So if we think about that as a management principle in the practice, what does that mean? And the other key principle here, and for those of you that are interested, you can go to the Shingo website, SHINGO, and there are 10 principles there for organizational excellence. And I'm only covering 2 of them today because these are the 2 that have the most to do with culture. Bill mentioned that. I do think this is a cultural issue. And so what we have to do is fundamentally understand what are the principles behind building a culture of excellence. One of them is respect for people. The other one is leading with humility. So as leaders, we have to recognize that we don't have all the answers, that actually the people that are in there pounding it away every day are generally the folks that have the answers to these problems. And when we think about burnout, if we give people the power to actually solve problems, it reduces burnout, and that's been shown in a number of studies in human healthcare. So that's really again, thinking about the work from the standpoint of establishing a set of principles by which we are going to manage, whether you're the veterinarian who's running your clinic or you're a consolidator who's running many clinics. The question is, what are the principles that we're going to espouse to build this culture of excellence and to reduce these problems that you all have, very clearly defined? I think, how that manifests. So I published an article in the Harvard Business Review recently, which talked about the principle of respect for people as it relates to safety of the worker. So, you talked about the safety issues within the veterinary practices. I mean, we have lots of safety issues within the human practices, right? So if we think about respect for people and we unpack that to the next level, what does that really mean? We need to keep our people safe. I mean, that is the ultimate respect. If we think about it from a management perspective, we need to keep our people safe. And so in this article, what we did was we sort of looked at the best practices of keeping people safe. Number one, set a goal of 0 workplace injuries. 0 workplace injuries. Now, that in my opinion, burnout is a workplace injury. Okay, so if we think about burnout, but also, am I exposing my workers to COVID? Am I, exposing them to other safety issues? We have to, as leadership, set 0. And if we set 0 and make that clear to our staff, that really that sends a huge message. It's like, okay, now I'm starting to get the feeling that you actually do respect me, because now what we're going to do is do things that actually have to do with me being safe. So we have to make staff safety one of those fundamental values, right? And that really comes from this idea of respect for people. Establishing processes that make then staff safety issues transparent. So in some hospitals now that we work with, every single staff injury is reported publicly or on the internet within the organization. What happened, where it happened, what the root cause was, and what the management team is doing differently to manage that. We need to also have some kind of system. Bill talked about the fact that there aren't very good systems. Well, when I started this work many years ago, we had no systems. And so what we have to do is build a system. Part of that system is creating a huddle process, which has to do with really getting the team together to understand what the problems are for the day, or bubbling up whatever problems that they find, and then having a management system that actually allows those problems to be solved either by the frontline worker or having to escalate it to the point where the decision can be made to fix the problem. This was beautifully shown at the Morningside Hospital in New York City when COVID first hit in March. They had basically a tiered huddle system where a lot of the issues related to staff safety in the COVID experience were bubbling into this management system, which they could then immediately address and change. In that article in HBR, we identified a lot of the details of how that huddle system worked for them. And then I think the other thing we need to think of as leaders is we don't want to make frontline heroism as an excuse not to act. So thank our frontline workers, that's terrific. But as a leader, we shouldn't have to make them into heroes. We should have systems and processes that make it very clear that they are safe and that they don't have to take risks. And that they're involved in solving problems that are arising every day. And if we create a system like that, then we know that things get better from a workplace standpoint. They get better from a safety standpoint. They get better from an emotional standpoint. And we can get rid of some of these things that you've identified. Obviously there's going to be continued problems, but if we have a system to actually manage those problems, and we can do it immediately. We don't have to wait for 6 months for somebody to make a decision, but we can fix that problem right now. That's going to go a long way to helping people have a better work-life balance, but also have a better workplace experience. So I do think this comes back to those two principles, which are respect for people and leading with humility, and leaders realizing that they don't have all the answers and that they have to rely on the staff. And those are the things that we've learned, and we continue to learn a lot in this world of organizational excellence. Especially COVID has taught us a lot about how the system works. But I'm convinced that it doesn't matter what industry you're in. These principles are universal human principles, and if we practice them, we will have a great team, and we'll have ultimately created an environment in which our staff really feel appreciated.
That's awesome. Thank you, John. So I think that my sort of the conclusive thought that I had going into it 2 years ago and talking to you, as you're hearing these experiences that we're having and thinking about the close industries to each other, you did say that, that it could work in any industry, but the similarities and the problems that we're seeing, does that hinder towards the we should try to apply these principles and follow already the path that's been paved in healthcare and try to apply these principles in the veterinary domain?
I mean, I don't know why this won't work in veterinary medicine. I don't know why it won't work. I think you have to run the experiment. You have to get some practices that are willing and interested to really go all in to try try this methodology. But it has been very successful where leadership has been committed in human healthcare. Why wouldn't it be successful in veterinary medicine? I don't know why. It seems to me that the problems, as outlined by Marie and Stephen, are exactly the same problems that human healthcare has. What you do is different, right? So you have different issues. You have different. The whole euthanasia thing, I think, is really different between veterinary medicine and human medicine. So there are some, I think, very different types of emotional issues, and the whole idea of compassion fatigue and other things probably is different in your industry than it is in human healthcare. But the reality is a lot of the problems are the same. So if we focus on those things, we know this method actually takes a lot of the headaches out of the work, and the headaches in the work, at least when I practiced for 20 years, was what was the biggest issue for me. I just couldn't stand having this incredibly inefficient process, where I was doing stuff I didn't think I needed to be doing, that somebody else could do that I'm running around looking for lab tests or this or that or whatever. And it's like, by the end of the day, you're so frazzled, it's just, crazy. And so to try to fix those kinds of things so that you can get the information you need when you need it, you can, that things run smoothly, that you're not, an hour and a half behind every day. All of those sorts of things are things that this methodology can address. And can it address some of the emotional things? I think that takes a different kind of problem solving process, because this is a social technical system. So there's a lot of technique behind it, but there's also a lot of social components behind it. And if you start from that principle-based focus, and especially now if we're talking about burnout, respect for people and lead with humility, if you really practice those principles, I have never seen it not work. If you really practice those principles, if you give lip service to it and say, yeah, I agree, but actually if you behave in the way that those principles dictate, I've never seen it not work.
Don, I know it works in individual practices. I've seen it. I'm sure everyone here has seen it in the veterinary space. Maybe it wasn't called lean or organizational excellence, but the principles that you're talking about they of course work. The question, right, is can it be done at scale, and is consolidation the delivery of that? You obviously have, healthcare systems that are probably the analogy to consolidation in the veterinary space. And so you may have a department or a hospital that functions on these principles, but does the healthcare system?
Well, not very many.
Right.
There are some, and I can name some that we worked with over the years. But even in our industry, this is not penetrated at the level that I had hoped. I mean, we did a study with UC Berkeley on the penetration of these principles. We found about 10% of systems actually were applying them at scale, but also at sophistication level that it'll work. So if you just do a little dabble here and a little dribble there, it doesn't matter. You really have to have an entire focus on the methodology from top to bottom in the system. And when you do that, and there are a number of systems that have done that now that we've written about, it absolutely works to scale. But it's the commitment at the top that matters. I mean, if that CEO and executive team are not committed to changing their own behavior, we just published a book about this called Becoming the Change. If you're not willing to change your behavior, then you shouldn't even try this, because it's not going to work.
Yeah. I have a question for you, John. So, I as a manager, I've tried to have a lean approach to people and say, I want you guys to work this out. I want you guys to come out with ideas. And I will admit, I was all about this kind of lean technique, let people do what people do best. And then I failed because my own controllingness, after a couple of failures, you mentioned a few headaches while implementing this kind of thought process, kicked in, and I said, okay, well, this isn't working right now. We're going back to the old way, and I'm just going to tell you what to do. So that was my failure. At what point and how do consolidators or managers, leaders in this industry, where is that line with how many headaches do we get before before we really see success with this type of program?
Yeah, well, the fact is, this is a learning by doing system, right? And we're going to make mistakes and we're going to fail. And one of the key things that we have to focus on is perseverance. We have to persevere despite our failures, as managers and as leaders. And so the more we can understand that what is the standard work management system we're talking about. My colleague Kim Barnes wrote a great book on this, there is a system that is important to be part of this transformation journey. If you just try to do it yourself without building a system, it just doesn't work. And that system is part of the management component of this. And within that system, you can then start to address these failures. And actually, the failure component of it is part of the learning system, because what you're doing is building your system as you go. It's not like there's a cookie cutter approach here. There's certainly been good books written on the lean management system, but the reality is you have to create it for your own organization. And if it's a small practice, that's a whole lot different than if it's a bunch of practices or a 1,000-bed hospital. And so that system is what you have to focus on. And that takes perseverance to really focus on that. It takes, in my opinion, it takes a coach. I could have never learned how to do this without a coach. My coach came from manufacturing, because nobody had ever done this in healthcare space 20 years ago. Now there's plenty of good healthcare leaders that can coach this stuff, but it's tough. I mean, especially at the middle manager level, I think that's the hardest place, because you're kind of getting squeezed between the top and the front line. And there are millions of people that are beating on you all the time. But there's a book called Beyond Heroes that my colleague wrote, and that is actually the best way to understand what a standard management system is. And I think that's really where that failure kind of leads to, let's go back to the old way, because we don't really understand the system. So I think as a manager, it's really important to understand, what does standard work for management mean? And Kim Barnes wrote a really nice book about that. David Mann's written good books on that, and others. But yeah, I think to have a better understanding of what a lean management system is before you go into it is probably one of the ways to be successful.
Thanks, John, for that. Go ahead, Bill.
You know, early on, I experienced what you just asked about, where, you know, empowering frontline staff. And my first approach was through training and education. And that made a difference, but it still didn't deliver it. And then we focused on some systems, and it improved a bit more, but it still didn't get there. It wasn't until culture, leadership, and trust, and responsibility, it wasn't until that was added to it that then people truly were able and willing to take responsibility for knowledge, for process, for communication, for their own behavior. And that was an aha moment for me. You know, it wasn't just, okay, here's the manual, or here's the process, or here's the checklist, or all that was built, right? But the piece that was missing was, again, the why, and you know, and the team culture piece. And once that's in place, it's so powerful. It's self-perpetuating, because then the team basically creates the environment. And if you don't fit in the environment, then you either change or you self-select. But it's a lot of work to get there.
So we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for contribution. You guys have been a tremendous help to put this together. So and everybody on the background. There's tons of questions that came through YouTube. We'll try to answer them. All the books that John referenced, we also will post on our blog as well as I want to throw in another book, Management on the Mend, which really inspired me. This is John's book about a lot of these things and his experience going through it. So I want to thank everybody. John, thank you for finding the time. Hopefully we'll approach this not only from the research and academic point of view, but actually take practical steps. And that's sort of what I'm inspired to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And hopefully we can all pull this through and influence the issue and make some significant changes. So thank you, guys. I appreciate your time, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.